I'm just curious, you were talking about that, I think it was the second case where...
Cancer?
No, sorry, maybe it was the first, the individual that had those very distinct cut marks on the bone from the metal weapon, saying that it wasn't part of that particular group or culture. So you thought that it was something that you still were trying to investigate, like is there any hypothesis as to was it another culture similar in the area, or that was just a bit more advanced, or any thought on that?
Yeah, we're trying to figure that out. What we need to do, and we've taken impressions so that we can put those lesions under the scanning electron microscope and actually prove that they're metal first.
Okay.
But you saw the one on the mandible, it's very thin. There's no way a stone tool could be sharp and heavy enough to make a cut mark like that. And my colleague from Oxford works on European sort of Mesolithic period. He's very familiar with what metal weapon wounds look like, and he's like, this is metal, absolutely. So we need to prove it with the SEM first, and we're working on that. And then it's a matter of trying to think what other cultures nearby, even if they're 1,000 kilometers away, had that kind of technology. And that would be really something to demonstrate that that kind of technology was used here. Obviously, there was a fight. Who knows what it was about? But are we talking about intrusions of territories? And if I could just go back and show you where we are at like Baikal.
Because that was again 4,500 years ago.
Mm-hmm. So, here, this map will do. So that site was here. And the area that we work in is all up here. But you know what hasn't been done? This area, which is called the Tunka Valley. So it's on my radar. I'm actually excavating here in the summer, but doing some excavations here is actually near the top of my list because we don't know much archaeologically about what was happening in this valley, which is directly adjacent to that site where that massacre happened. So there's so many questions I don't know. I wish I knew, but we're looking into it. So I think a lot of really interesting perspectives can come out about human interactions and movements and migration of people. And at some point there were at least one, but possibly two massive clashes. And it could have been something petty. They could have been fighting over a woman, for goodness sake, but possibly something much more interesting and compelling than that. So we're working on it. I don't know, honestly. And it's okay to say I don't know, but we're looking into it.
Well, it makes you think if they were more advanced with those kind of weapons that from an agricultural perspective and resources,
there was no agriculture at that time at all. It's much later that we have pastoral. In fact, there was no agriculture in this region until European Russians moved in. So there was pastoralism about 1,000 years later, like horse, nomadic horse and goats, I believe, but no agriculture, real agriculture in terms of plant production until the European Russians moved west after 1700. So they remained hunters and gatherers until very recently. But yeah, definitely there was a technological disadvantage if someone had, swords or axes or things made of metal, and these people didn't. Yeah.
Have you considered time?
I like how you think. Do you have a time machine? I would have no job if you had a time machine. You could just sit back and find out. Yeah.
Mesopotamia wasn't at that time advanced.
Yes, yes, definitely. I'm not saying there was no agriculture in the world at this time. There was just no agriculture here. The first agriculture was as early as 10,000 years ago.
Was there metal tools?
Sorry?
Was there metal weapons and tools?
They didn't have metal weapons or tools. All the metal they had were things like copper bracelets.
Was there?
Yes. Yes, there were metal tools elsewhere. In south in China, which is actually where we think they got some of the bronze. Very far west in Mesopotamia, possibly even in South Asia. That might be a bit early for South. But yeah, there was metal elsewhere. There was metal in the world and metal tools in the world, just not in this region like this.
There's also ore though too. If you use hematite or any kind of ore rock in the same sense.
But they weren't. We have no evidence that they were making those kinds of. We have no evidence that they were making those kinds of tools. Yeah, they could have. Some of the metal could have been sourced locally. But they weren't forming them into actual tools or weapons, just speculative.
Okay.
Maybe I missed your question.
Confused. What was the evidence you have? Were they metal heads or?
The arrowheads that they were using were all stone. So they didn't, all of their tools, knives, things like that were made out of flake stone.
They were
that was ground stone. So their adzes that they were using were ground stone, and ground stone is really fast.
With the chips, were they
arrowheads. Arrowheads. Except for the chops on the mandible, they were all arrowheads. Yeah.
Are any of these candidates for some DNA genomic analysis, especially if you're trying to see if maybe they're a family group that were related? I mean, presumably there was plenty of inbreeding within these small communities that you could say how related they were.
Yeah,
so
we
what's
actually,
the stats of that?
yeah, we've been running DNA out of the University of Alberta. Preservation is not very good, and we haven't been doing next-gen sequencing, which is what we need to start doing. Actually, I've got a contact in the UK, so we're going to start running some next-gen ones. What we do know at this point, and this is based on ancient DNA technology from 10 years ago, so it's a bit dated now, is that those two groups before and after that hiatus, I told you there was a period where there was no cemeteries, they're distinct biologically. But we haven't got the resolution to look at individuals within the cemeteries or among the cemeteries within a similar time period to know if they're family groups, for example. Because at some of the cemeteries, you've got rows of graves or clusters of graves, and that has to have some kind of meaning. But the DNA is not preserved well enough, at least our technology is not there yet to be able to say this is a family group, this is the Smith family, and this is the Johnson family, because sometimes the DNA is just so degraded we can't see that yet. But with advances in DNA technology, we're getting there, absolutely. So we'll see what this next gen stuff does. But that will answer a lot of questions. And what else will answer a lot of questions are strontium isotopes of the bones, because then we can tell where people are from. We can tell if they're local or not, because if you're local, you're going to have the same strontium signature as the rocks and the water around you. If you're not local, you're going to have a strontium signature in your bones and teeth from wherever it is you were from. So we can not only tell genetic linkages, but whether people are outsiders or whether they were born and raised there, for example. If we see different signatures in their teeth that were forming when they were children, as opposed to their probably weren't cooking at all, but some food is just easier to consume, especially if you think of plant foods, if they're cooked, as opposed to
wild game, they hunted, say, an elk, did they cook that food thoroughly? Was there,
I don't know how thoroughly they cooked it. We do know that they suffered from parasites that they got from being closely, linked up to dogs and domestic or tamed wolves. So there's a echinaceous, I think it is, parasite that has half of its life cycle in deer and half in wolves or dogs. But because these guys were spending so much time with either domesticated dogs or tame wolves, there's a fine line, that we've actually seen evidence of these parasites in the people too. So perhaps they weren't cooking their food well enough because they were able to get it anyways. These parasites, but I'm sure they were cooking some of it. That kind of thing is really hard to see archaeologically, but because we have ceramic pots, that's good evidence that they were cooking at least some of it.
And like, just generally speaking, I was wondering when humans started probably like that.
We haven't, but we've been using fire for almost 2 million years, and maybe for cooking, but maybe for keeping predators at bay, maybe for lots of reasons, right? That doesn't mean you use it all the time. And in fact, in this part of the world, you don't eat fish cooked. When I go there, you just eat it raw. So depending on the food that it was, some of it was probably preferably consumed fresh and raw, and then others probably would have been smoked and dried. You'd have to preserve some of it. So I don't know. That's a good question, but some of those things are just impossible to know, just from the evidence that we have. Yeah.
I believe that area stayed the last ice age.
Yes, the last ice age was over about 10,000 years ago, so this is all post ice age.
But isn't that area didn't go back like 9,000 years before? I was wondering how old human settlement is.
In about the last 20,000 years, people have been there. But you're right. And actually, there is some evidence very close here because the Altai Mountains aren't that far away, where we have the Denisovans, which are 40,000, 60,000 years old. So this part of Siberia was probably never completely glaciated. It's just a matter of being so cold and ornery that nobody wanted to live there. In this particular region, for at least the last 20,000 years, you've got pretty much continuous human occupation, and there's possibly evidence that at that 40 or 60,000 years even.
How much of the year is it accessible?
Well, now it's just like here. The lake doesn't freeze completely usually till January, and that's when they would go across the lake, because who wants to go all the way around it? It's about 500 kilometers long. So it doesn't completely freeze up till January, but then it doesn't completely thaw until May either. And spring is when they would have been doing the sealing, right? With the seal ones. Yeah.
With the one that had the cancer, did you mention how old that was?
4,500 years.
No, how old the...
Oh, I didn't, but I think it was he was between about 40 and 45, so he wasn't particularly old, actually. So lung cancer, especially for prostate cancer, you would expect him to be quite a bit older for prostate cancer. But and those are just the best possible lung or prostate. He could have suffered from any other kind of skin or who knows, carcinoma. Yeah, but not terribly old. Yeah.
And these guys have kind of raw activity,
Yeah, you can tell how rapidly it grows by what the bone looks like. So if you have solid, rounded chunks of bone forming, then it's slower growing. If you have really spiculated kind of hair on end, then it's a really fast-growing cancer. This is kind of medium. Benign cancer is really a continuum, right? From completely benign, like a wart, to really, really fast, aggressive. And there isn't a line where you say now it's malignant and now it's benign. So it's a progressive condition, and some really slow-growing ones cause just really solid bone chunks to form, and really fast-growing ones cause this really spiculated. So this is near the fast, but not so aggressive. He probably lived for months, actually, as it progressively got worse, and was very debilitated, obviously, at the end.
So how long would he have needed care?
Oh, probably the last couple of months, for sure. I mean, you could see he wouldn't be able to walk, yeah. But he probably was cared for. He probably, the cancer wouldn't have advanced this far if there wasn't somebody to care for him. He would have been gravely ill several months before he died, probably having seizures and things occasionally and having difficulties with mobility. So we see a natural progression of the disease, yes, but we see a natural progression of disease with care. Yeah. Yeah.
What's significance of the way that cancer begins?
Most of the burials were laid on the back, stretched out. We called it extended and supine. And most of the people men at that time would have been buried with hunting, knives and arrowheads and that kind of stuff, hunting sort of gear. He was buried curled up in a fetal position on his front with his head kind of wrenched back like that, with that beautifully carved spoon and then an ornamental bone tubule, sort of like an ornament that I didn't have a picture of. So two really unique things, not hunting gear, and curled up in this pit. He was also, that cemetery where he was buried had 3 graves, and it was only about 2 kilometers from a cemetery from the same time period that had about 70 graves. So this unique little cemetery, very close but not the same one, and in this really unusual body position. I don't know what it means, but it means there's something unique about him that warranted unusual cemetery, unusual body position, and this very unusual spoon. Yes.
People are not trying to figure out the concept of this. Do they use any spices in their food?
It's really hard to, there aren't a lot of spices in that part of the world, I'm just trying to think of it, but those kinds of things don't preserve very well archaeologically. There was a Siberian princess story in the news a couple of years ago where they actually found cannabis with the mummified remains, but she was, I think, 1,500 years more recent. So in essence, I don't know. I can't tell you what they used. I'll bet you they had some medicinal plants that would have alleviated discomfort and perhaps put people into an altered state of mind. I would hope, for his sake, that he had access to something like that, but I don't know.
If he was a shaman, maybe he used these spices on himself.
Yeah, I hope he did.
But they might cause the cancer itself, because I've heard there are some plants actually carcinogenic.
Yeah, well, and if you think about inhaling wood smoke, there's lots of things. If he had lung cancer, for example, it could have just been because he lived in a cold area and they used wood for fires to stable. I don't know. But there are so many other things like infectious conditions and genetic conditions that can cause cancer. I don't think we should just think about environmental carcinogens, right? There's lots of other possibilities. Yeah, sorry.
Well, this is more anthropological, but what would cause a culture to sacrifice a more useful material like bronze just for decorative purposes instead of using it for tools and weapons?
I don't think they have the technology yet to make stone weapons, metal weapons and tools out of it. They were mostly importing it from southern China, to the south in China, and they were probably getting small bits and then just reworking it by pounding, or so they weren't doing metal work essentially. They just had small pieces that were decorative. Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned the idea of the question we have of life back then being nasty version. Sure. I think, and particularly talking about age. I just may have missed what you said, but why is it that impression is changing?
It's changing because, well, one reason is that it's notoriously difficult to age skeletons that are old, like old individuals. If you're over essentially 40, the margin of error is so great, you could look like a 60-year-old or a 20-year-old. So that's one of the problems, is we don't have very good ways to age people over about 30 or 40, so there's more and more error. And because of that, the profiles that we reconstructed from ancient cemeteries have a misrepresentation of younger individuals than older ones, because we're really bad at aging old people. Another reason is that we know that people died young in antiquity, but mostly that was during childhood and infancy. And once you got through that period, the evidence, they're doing statistical analyses, all kinds of people are doing really new statistical analyses to sort of demonstrate that, in fact, other than the high infant and child mortality, people were not particularly dying any sooner than they were in any pre-industrial society. So up until about 500 years ago, the same essential life expectancy if you got through infancy and childhood. So there's a couple of references I can give you, but we're starting to sort of reevaluate the fact that people all died young, that 40 was a decrepit old man 3,000 years ago, probably wasn't. If you think about physically fit people, always working, they probably weren't decrepit and old at 40. They were probably still pretty darn vital. Yeah.
Is it that method we use now, is it something involving back by chance?
It involves the roots of the teeth. That's the new method for aging individuals. The other methods we've used have looked at bone joint surfaces and stuff, and there's just so much error. There's so much individual variation, but there's a new method that involves cutting into the roots of the teeth and looking at the outside layer called cementum. And actually, it's kind of like the rings on a tree, that every year you're alive, your cementum lays down two little layers, a dark band and a light band. And if you count those and then subtract by the date that the tooth erupted, you can get within a few years really accurate ages. But you have to have good preservation and you have to cut the teeth. And we're often not allowed to do destructive analysis, and you need to have a microscope and a lab and all of that. But it's a new method that I think is really quickly gaining ground, where we'll be able to get really accurate ages for whole populations, and be able to say this person was 86 and this person was 58 instead of this person was 40 to 60. That's not very helpful. Yeah.
Why are they not allowing destructive analysis?
We do some destructive analysis, but the Russian university is very particular about keeping these remains for future analyses. So
people that have a mental set to not, how shall we say, destroy because they're human? Or,
right, no, it's not that. Doing that kind of work in this part of the world, as you know, would be a very sensitive issue. In Russia, that's not the issue. In fact, the local indigenous people don't consider themselves descended, so they're fine with it. It's just that there's a lot of researchers coming in from the West, and the Russian scholars want to protect the remains. And if everybody took a sample, there would be nothing left. So they have to be a little bit choosy. And we have taken samples for bone, DNA and for bone chemistry and things. We just have to. We can't take samples every time we invent a new technique, because then there won't be skeletons left. So we have to be a little bit discerning. We have taken some, and we probably will take more, but we have to be careful. Yeah, sorry.
Do you sample for on pathogens?
You know what? We haven't. I remember one point one of my colleagues was taking sediment samples from the gut, hoping to look for pollen and things like that. The preservation after this is quite poor, and in fact, the cemeteries that I was working at had such the graves were only about 30 centimeters under the modern ground surface, which means that the sedimentation rate was so low that most of the stuff in the grave wouldn't have been dumped on the body when it died, but just grew in over the last couple of thousand years. So we haven't had much success. That doesn't mean that there aren't other cemeteries where it might be successful, for sure. Every day almost there are new techniques. Now we're actually taking the tartar or the calculus off of the teeth, and we can reconstruct diet from that. You can actually find bacteria that were in their gut embedded in the calcified tartar on their teeth. Of their bones, the cross sections of the bones change dramatically. And we've done that at Bifal too, and you can see that they're absolutely active. These people are walking and hiking everywhere. You can see it on the muscle attachment sites and the shapes of their bones and their brightest patterns in their joints. Really, really active.
Can
Sorry.
In regards to what you were just talking about, the shape of the bone changing, I've also noticed that you get some people, for whatever reason, the joints are relative to the mid portion the mid portions be relatively small compared to the joint. And where I've noticed it is when you have people who have rings on their fingers, and the rings are difficult to get over the joints, but yet in between they turn over and this type of thing.
I think what you're seeing is probably osteoarthritis, which is something that we all suffer from eventually as we get old. And so when there's arthritis, osteoarthritis, there's bone formation on those joint surfaces, and then sometimes there's swelling around it. So that's why sometimes you'll see these enlarged joints when the bones in between aren't particularly large.
I can understand you saying that, because I do know that the joints are large with the osteoarthritis. But in this case, the ancestry is native to North America that I'm talking about, the way I've noticed.
I'm not aware of that. I'll have to look into it.
Like it's pronounced, whereas, like you see people with exceedingly large bones and small bones, but it just happens that the people that I came across had native ancestry, and the joints were large, and the in between was relatively small.
I don't know. I'll look into that. Yeah.
Are there any evidence of periodic famine?
Yes and no. Famines per se are pretty much impossible to show, but we can see on the dental enamel on the teeth that when your teeth are growing, when you're a child, if you're subjected to any prolonged episode of stress, so a few days to a few weeks, whether it's nutritional stress or infection or something like that, your body will take all of its resources away from growing and put them towards keeping you alive. And then when you recover, what you see in the enamel on the teeth are little grooves or lines that represent that period of sort of stop, the cessation of growth, and then it picks up again. And so we can see that there were periods of stress during infancy and childhood, even while sometimes babies were breastfeeding. We don't know exactly what the stress was, but because these are small populations, infectious diseases would probably have been low, so it's almost certainly nutritional. And in fact, you can see that there's an annual pattern every year, which probably correlates to late winter, early spring, when resources are most scarce. Even when you're hunting animals, you're hunting rabbits that are skinny, and you can starve to death eating a fat-free rabbit, as you know. So there are periods that indicate that there was definitely nutritional stress. Even babies that were, or small children that were still breastfeeding on their mothers, we could see the development of those indicators on the enamel of the teeth. And the beautiful thing about the enamel on your teeth is it never changes, right? Unlike your bone that's always growing and modifying, your enamel is your enamel. Unless you wear it away, you're going to see those lines even when you're 100 years old. They're still going to indicate that you had that stress period at that particular age. So yes and no. We've seen evidence of nutritional stress. Yeah.
I have a general question that might cause us as skeptics here. In regards to archaeology, what is the limitations of finding fossils in there? Like say the kind of soil.
Yeah, so it really, it's so variable in terms of the preservation. So the depth of the burial is one thing, really shallow graves, or not burying your dead at all. The best thing you can do to preserve a human skeleton or body is to bury it. The next best thing is to bury it really, really deep in a soil that is basic and not acidic. That's why we don't have bones from this part of the world in boreal forests, because it's acidic. We don't have animal bones. We've got nothing more than a couple hundred years old. So because these populations were burying their dead, which is pretty unusual for hunters and gatherers, and because at some of the sites they were being buried in limestone, which is basic, preservation is really, really good. But there's just so many variables that take place. There's so many variables to consider. Whether there's water percolating through the site, whether there's a little animal. They have little ground squirrels. They're called sleek. And if they have burrows and they're going in there and pulling out bones, I mean, all of those things will take a toll. So sometimes it's just hit and miss. the truth is we're only finding the best case scenarios, right? We're not finding everybody who was buried, and we're certainly not finding everybody who died. We're just finding the best case scenarios that happen to be preserved over thousands of years. And in fact, some of the bones that are 8,000 years old are way better preserved than some of the bones that are 3,500 years old. And it's not because of the age as much as it's just the circumstances of the burial environment, whether it's shallow or waterlogged or acidic or so on and so forth.
Right, I was just wondering because usually if you argue with some of these questions of evolution, when people talk about whether there's gaps in layers or little gaps in fossil records and stuff like that, this is direct how do you argue that with regards to the oddity of fossils?
Tell them that you don't need fossils to prove evolution. I mean, the fossils are like icing on the cake. You have comparative biology, you have genetics, you have all of these other things. You don't need the bloody fossils, but we have them anyway. So probably best not to argue with those people because it's like arguing with a small child. So that's insulting to a small child. It's like arguing with the wall. So people will believe what they want to believe, right? And it doesn't matter what we say.
You had interactions with your evolution?
Not as much as you think. In my human evolution class, I always at the very beginning, I say, this is not a forum for debate. I don't care what your beliefs are or aren't. This is what we're going to do. You don't have to believe. This is what I don't want it. And I've actually expected hate mail or emails or people to go on Rate My Professor, but never. And in fact, when I talk about Neanderthal cannibalism, for example, I talk about ritual cannibalism, and I say that Roman Catholics ritually cannibalize Jesus Christ every Sunday, and I always expect that, but or hate mail, nothing. So they're so polite in Saskatchewan, I guess, right? Sorry, they're going to kick us out. One more question. Yes.
Sorry, just quick about the impossible wound. I was just wondering, are there any working ideas of how that could have happened? Like maybe just the body dismembered or something, and then like target practice?
Which one?
You said the impossible wound. What was it? The socket joint.
He wasn't dismembered. That's just it. I think what happened is he was probably on the ground with his legs splayed out and rotated, and it was just a fluke. You can actually see a little nick on the cup of the hip socket. It's almost an impossible wound, but it happened.
Yeah.
So it was just a matter of a strange body position. Probably he was already on the ground when that shot was done. Yeah, it's the strangest. And that's why we took that little chip out and put it under the microscope. We're like, it's a point. It's definitely a point. But it's really weird. Yeah, sometimes I guess one in a million, right? Yeah. Okay.